welcome from wherever you're coming in. My name's Sarah Dukevich, and I'm going to take you through domain storytelling. What is it? How you can use it, both in a domain-driven design environment and honestly in just any environment in reality. So first, I want to start out by telling a story. And I'm going to warn you ahead of time. I am a developer. I am not a designer. So I don't do pretty drawings. I am a horrible artist. I am a graphic designer's job security. I promise them. But I wanted to tell this story because it was one of those where, as it all played out, I was like, this is perfect for domain storytelling. So I was out at a restaurant with my kids. I have two boys, they're 9 and 11. We like going out to eat every now and then just because they think they're getting away with something. So talked with them and I'm like, all right, tell me, what do we do at a restaurant when we go out to eat? So they're like, well, we read the menu. Like, yeah. And we tell the order to the waiter or the waitress. Okay. Then we wait. And I'm like, yeah, I know you guys don't like waiting. They're like, but then the food comes in. So then we eat our food. They eat the pizza. Then we pay with money. We say thank you. And then we go. Mom, don't forget the say thank you part. So I made sure to include the say thank you part. But these are the steps that we take when I go out to eat with the kids. But me being the mom that I am, I was just like, all right, let's see what they're actually paying attention to. I was like, how do we pay? And their story was, well, mom just scribbles on any piece of paper and then we leave. That's how mom pays. But any piece of paper, I could even scribble on a napkin and then we'd be good to go, according to the kids. I never really realized how oversimplified they made that process until they went out with my mom. My mom took them out to dinner and she went to go pay with cash. Now I pay with credit card because that's just how I roll. So with grandma pulling out cash, they're like, Grandma, what are you doing? And grandma's like, what do you mean? What am I doing? And so this is where they're like, Grandma, that's not how we pay. Mom just scribbles on paper. And my mom is crying at this point because really, we just scribble on paper and go? What kind of shenanigans am I up to? And I'm like, no, 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 I promise you. This is just their story. But what I'm here to show you is it's more than just a kid's perspective. It's as adults. If we don't know a process, we may oversimplify that process. We might be like, oh, well, we're just shipping things. But listen, just because a process seems simple doesn't actually mean that it's going to be that way. So we have to have these conversations to understand, are the systems simple? Are the processes simple? So then I was talking with the kids. I'm like, all right, mom doesn't just scribble on paper. You can't keep telling people this because they're going to think mom is doing bad things. I'm like, Mom, this is what happens. And so I had explained to them that the waitstaff brings the bill, and then I review the bill. And then I take my credit card, put it in the folio or in that book thing that they bring. And that the waitstaff takes it, and then they process the payment, and then they come back. Then I take that receipt, and then I scribble on the receipt. I sign on there. And they're like, wait, what is actually scribbling, Mom? I'm like, actually, it's just fast cursive. They're like, oh, that makes so much more sense. But they're like, Mom, that's still too many steps. But the thing is, we had the conversation and now they realize that it's not as simple as just scribble on a piece of paper and go. These are the steps that are happening. And when I drew it out, then they were able to understand the process better. They were able to see, oh, there are steps. We don't necessarily see it because it all happens so fast, but when mom draws it out, it makes sense. Again, though, bad artistry. So I apologize ahead of time if it's like, what are those? So with that story, let's talk about what is domain storytelling. We'll talk about who is involved with this. Why? Well, you're starting to see that it's not just a simple process unless you have those conversations and understand it. And then where or how is domain storytelling? So we'll look at all those. And we'll look at the tool. I'm going to show you that I didn't have to draw with. But before I even get started, what is a domain? Feel free to come off mute and chime in. So I'm not talking like a domain like nimblepros.com or deviq.com. I'm not talking about website domains. I'm not talking about TLDs. I'm not talking about any of that. When I think of a domain, I guess the best way I explain it to people is it's the subject area for where your problem lies. For me, I could be working in healthcare, I could be working in e-commerce, I could be working in entertainment, in insurance, in finance, manufacturing. My domain is going to be whatever that industry or whatever that particular process is in there. Now, if you're in a domain-driven design environment, a DDD environment, they get into things like core domains and subdomains. We don't need to get into that depth. Right now, we just need to care about what is our subject area? What is the problem or what is the process that we're trying to understand better? What is the environment it lives in? So domain storytelling is you're capturing the stories of what's happening in that domain. For the emails and for the landing page to here, you've seen this picture in those emails. You've seen that picture in the landing page. This is the process of how do you sign up for one of our webinars? What goes on? How's the email? You get the email. After this, you'll get a thank you recording, probably either end of day today or first thing tomorrow. Once the recording's done processing, I finish it and send it off. Then you can watch the recording and share the recording with others. So domain storytelling is the pictorial representation of a story. What's nice about it is when you're in these domain storytelling sessions, you're getting people involved who know the process, they know the domain, and they teach each other and teach us with the stories. They help build what's known as a ubiquitous language. So we could do things like talk about the term client. What's a client? Are we talking about a customer? We could use the term client to refer to that. Are we using developer speak and talking about HTTP clients? What is client? There's an ambiguity until there's context. Ubiquitous language helps you to establish that context and take away some of that ambiguity and helps you to use the right terms. The problem that I see a lot in companies is when you're dealing with the tech side and then you have the business. So like your marketing and your logistics and things like that. And the frustrations I hear from both sides is that nobody's listening and nobody's talking to each other. And it's like, hold up. In order to survive and to thrive and to be successful, you have to be able to communicate. And sometimes you have to like listen to each other and trust each other's expertises. So don't have developers talking about logistics terms until they've actually listened to the logistics people with the right terms and using them properly. Develop that ubiquitous language. Learn from each other in that and build a shared understanding. There are so many places, the larger companies I deal with, I see a lot of silos. And so we focus on our silo, but we don't know what the other people are doing. Well, here at Nimble Pros, we've worked in siloed environments, but people keep coming to us because we know how to navigate the silos. We have those conversations and we teach others how to have those conversations as well. You want to have the conversations where you're using the words that everybody understands. Domain storytelling will help you do that. Now, who's involved? So there's domain experts, people who understand your area. Typically, you'll have a moderator, so somebody to ask the questions during the stories and keep the session moving, but getting enough detail for whatever your goals are with the domain storytelling session. Then there's a visualizer. That's somebody who draws. And then you have your developers. And the reason why I include the developers is you want the people who are creating the solutions to understand the problem. And they don't necessarily have the ability to talk with the domain experts. Unless they're in something like a domain storytelling or some kind of other conversation, that really has to happen. Bring the developers so that they can ask the questions, because if they ask the questions of the domain experts, then the domain experts may have some more details that they might not share as part of their story initially because of expert blind spot. The problem is experts of things is that we understand our expertise and we understand all these fine-grained details. But the thing is, we take our knowledge for granted and we forget about certain things because we just do it. So have the outsiders, have the developers, ask the domain experts about these things. Get the details. All right, so now why? Why do we want to do domain storytelling? Well, again, build that ubiquitous language. Get everybody on the same page, using the same words. And when somebody says a word, they know what they're talking about. You want to better understand your domain. So a lot of times you'll have the domain will be something on the business side, and the text will come in and will be like, we can write websites, we can write apps, we can spin up infrastructure, but we have no idea what this business process actually is. So domain storytelling will definitely help shed light on that. Also can have those conversations that leads you to understand who your go-tos are for these different things in the domain. Because I mentioned like logistics. I used to work in a e-commerce environment, and we had to deal with shipping and logistics and things like that. And for a while there, we would get questions, and the developers are like, I don't know who to talk to. But we had enough conversations with our project managers, who are the ones who did our stories, and they were able to help us identify who the people were. So sometimes having these stories helps you to identify, these are my go-to people when I don't understand what the heck is going on. Now, why domain storytelling? Because it'll help you analyze a process. It'll help you to understand what is that process in terms of the steps to take. Domain storytelling does not have to be deep dive into details for all the processes. You can use it to deep dive, but you can also use it to stay high level. If you remember with my restaurant story, I talk about payment processing. The wait staff takes my credit card and does payment processing. But I'm not going into the details of how they have to put it through there, how they have to do shift 4 or authorization or any of those details. Not important. Not important to the story at the time. You're going to do that with your own domain storytelling experiences, only getting the details to the depth that you need. Analyze those processes, understand what the steps are. Now, you'll want to also build a shared understanding across the departments. You might use domain storytelling to help gather requirements, because you may find that the business does a better job of explaining what they want by telling stories. And so if you listen to them, you understand, oh, they want this feature and this is how they're going to use it. Sometimes people speak in stories, so that makes it easier. Sometimes domain storytelling can help you identify boundaries of a domain. And you can figure out what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Where does this fall? What's within the boundaries? What's outside of the boundaries? Where do we put a line here and say, let's talk about this in another discussion? So domain storytelling, this is why we're dealing with this, is because it allows us to do these things. Now, if you want to do domain storytelling, what are the supplies that you need? So you saw my bad drawings. You've seen some of the icons, but this is another way of doing this as well. And this is the whiteboard that's actually behind me, not the coffee shop, but my whiteboard behind me. So I have Post-it notes, and I have a whiteboard, and I have dry erase markers. And this is going through that same process where I've got a person, that's me, bad drawing, long hair. And then there's the wait staff, payment processing, things like that. So if I was doing this in person, if we were all in person, I would probably have flip charts. Flip charts I like because you can put on an easel either landscape or a portrait to tell your story. This particular story fit well portrait, but more often than not, I probably would start landscape. Flip charts, rolls of paper, or a whiteboard with dry erase markers works. Sticky notes make a world of difference for laying out your objects, which we'll talk about here in the next slide. And then pens and markers for drawing lines, drawing numbers, making notes on what those lines are. We'll talk about their technical term here in a minute. So in person, I would have this conversation. It might be a couple people, might be maybe a team of people, but only have the people in there who can tell the story of the process or who can tell the story of the problem, and then the people who can draw it out. These stories can then be useful to refer to later as you're trying to solve the problem. Now, I also have to acknowledge that in person is awesome and you can get lots of stories, but we're also in a spot where people are hybrid, and we're also in a spot where people are remote only. The team that I work for here at Nimble Pros, we're all remote. So if we're going to do any domain storytelling with clients, we're going to be dealing typically digitally, which means we need a whiteboard of some sort, digital markers of some sort, or a tablet perhaps. You could do Microsoft Whiteboard. There are other things I recommend later on. But you need icons, And egon.io you don't necessarily need, but it's a tool that I recommend, and we will be taking a demo of that because that was built with the domain storytelling. Uh, the guys who created domain storytelling, they're the ones who also create the egon.io tool. So we'll talk about that here in a bit. But before we do that, let's get past the things and the stuff, and let's talk about their terms. So there are some key concepts with domain storytelling that you need to know about. There are actors. These are the I don't want to call them items, but they're not all these people either. So they're person, people, software systems. They're the ones that do things. They're the ones that perform activities. So you've got actors. You also have work objects. So these are the things that are being acted upon, but they don't do the acting. And then there's activities. So those are the arrows that you saw. And they're usually labeled with some kind of verb for the first arrow. Then you get into things like of or for or by or in for some of those arrows. They are directionally indicated, so the arrowhead makes a difference. You may have a number on there. Annotations. So I didn't have any annotations on my hand-drawn ones, but I did in the digital one where I talked about the domain storytelling tag. We'll talk about that in context here in a little bit. But annotations help you to capture your assumptions, your variations, your exceptions. You can make note of whether things are required or optional. That's a good way of making annotations. And then again, the numbers are used to indicate which steps of the activities are performed. These things can be done in parallel as well. So you can have multiple steps happening at the same time. In this particular example, just so you can see the key concepts laid out. So we've got the actor. Only thing here in this storyline that's performing any activities is our actor. They perform an activity on a work object. That work object may be related to another work object. And you could have an annotation here. And this is the step number. Now you're probably just like, all right, actors, work objects, this sounds pretty eh. Here, let's give you some more context. I have a person who's applying for a loan for a house, and they don't want to fix her up her house because certain loans require that you can't have that. So this is the actor is the person. The applies, that's your activity. Your loan and your house are work objects. The loan is technically not doing an activity on the house. That is a supporting declaration, but just so you can see how those key concepts come out. Okay, so let's talk about icon representations. These are some standard icons that you'll see in egon.io, which is the domain modeler tool that goes with domain storytelling. So domain storytelling itself, there's a website, domainstorytelling.org, and they have a book as well. There's a digital copy and a printed copy. I would say if you can go digital, I recommend the digital copy as well because it's got really good content, but I steer you clear from the physical just because the copy I've received, you can see the text from other pages kind of bleeding through a little bit. It's noisy. So go digital if you can, if you do get the book. But they use these icons in the book as well. So we have an egon.io version 1. So there's their actors. By default, person, group, and system are what are loaded. And then for work objects, this is the default set here. In V2 beta, this is currently what they look like. The interface, you can toggle between actor, work object, and none here. And these are also the standard icons that you'll see. Now, I'm not going to show V2 beta today. And the reason is because V2 beta, I've worked with it a little bit, but it hasn't been consistent. It's a beta. As developers, we understand betas, they're works in progress. Now, these icons are used, they're Google material icons, the material symbols specifically. What's nice about this egon.io tool is that we can do animated stories as well. And so I wanted to show this. was going to do this on the landing page, but the animation wasn't consistent enough for me to get it to work properly. So I wanted to show you here what it looked like. Now this is important because on this particular one, it's all like out of order is what it looks like, because you have 1 here, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. We're bouncing around. But the animation makes it a little bit easier to see those steps and how they're performed. Oh, where else would I use domain storytelling? So payment processing is a huge one. Having to deal with different credit cards, dealing with different authorizations. So thinking of things like the standard dealing with Visa and MasterCard, okay, Discover, fine. Now we get into one of the places I worked with, they had custom credit cards of their own. And then they have rewards cards and gift cards. That all complicates things. So I would do domain storytelling to walk through the various scenarios there so that we have a checklist as developers of, okay, we need to do payment processing. What does it look like when a customer goes through and pays with whatever we're looking at? Another place for domain storytelling would be like an application process. Loans, insurance, anything really that has an application process. Because the thing you have to think of is, okay, as a actor, as a user, as a whatever my person is, I want to apply for a loan. It's never as simple as just fill out a form and magically yes or no. There's that black box. Well, we can go in that black box sometimes as developers if that's where our jobs take us. And so now we need to talk about, okay, I need to get a credit score. What does that entail? Do I need to get it from one or multiple credit unions? Things like that. So having those conversations with people who deal with it professionally, so the people who have to deal with processing the payments, what does that process look like? Having those stories and drawing it out makes a world of difference, especially for developers who we want to solve the problem. We really do, but we don't always know what lies ahead in that process. I think about patient experience as well. So having a friend in the conference speaking circuit, they had a tragedy with their child, and they tell a story about going to the hospital on an emergency case. And it's like, well, if you think about that situation and drawing it out, you now have the patient experience of what is it like to use a website under crisis? What happens when, for example, let's say that my kid got in an accident, crashed their bike, gushing everywhere, based on a true story. And so now we got to figure out where's the closest ER. And then we need to figure out, is it covered by the insurance? And so now we have to go through and draw out that process of, okay, what does this really look like? Well, still critically in an emergency haze of, I have an emergency, I just need answers, get me there. So domain storytelling, the speaker told the story of what it was like to use a hospital's website while worried about their child in an emergency case. We learned about the crisis persona. For him to tell that story, now as a website developer, I understand that a crisis persona might be something I have to think about. It's something I have to consider. He told the story of a domain that I never would have thought about. If you're in the healthcare world, dealing with an emergency case versus a specialist versus a general practitioner, different environments, different stories altogether, from scheduling to availability. So having those domain storytelling conversations of what is it like to schedule an appointment for one of these versus what is it like to drop in? Experience, storytelling to draw that out. E-commerce, I've done a lot of customer experience stories. I have a client who's got an e-commerce site where they sell items. And you think, oh, okay, like I'm going to go to a store, I want one of these items and go. But imagine if you had something like gift baskets, and say those gift baskets have something like fruit and meat and trinkets from a city. So being in Northeast Ohio, let's say we want to include stuff from like Cleveland in there to be like, hey, Cleveland baskets, stuff like that. Well, now you don't have just a single item. Now you have a complex item. And so drawing out the domain storytelling of, well, what does that process look like? I want to purchase a gift basket. I want to purchase a gift basket that I can build out. Okay, so now what are those steps? Again, a client I was working with, they were just like, yeah, we just want to purchase an item. And then when I came back, I gave them 6 different stories for 6 different types of ways to buy things on their site. And they're like, oh, we never thought about it that way. You have to have these conversations to realize, oh, it might not be as simple as I had initially thought. I never really thought about this, and that other step. I used to work in manufacturing as well. IT department, there were 4 of us, figurehead boss and 3 IT people who had to be out on the floor. And so one of the things I worked for with the manufacturing crew is what's called a router, and tracking the parts and knowing which stations the parts went to. I was an outsider to manufacturing altogether, so I didn't know terms. Like when I think router, I'm thinking, okay, this is some kind of tool. I think it's woodworking tools. Um, or I'm thinking the network router. I'm married to an IT guy. We've been plenty of routers. I've seen those. Used to work in DSL installation. I've installed routers. So a router in manufacturing? Nope. That's actually barcodes and tells you which stations the parts go to. So I learned something about that and learned that ubiquitous language. It was an experience that if I could go back in time and do domain storytelling for that younger version of me, I would understand a lot of the concepts a lot better, a lot quicker because of those stories. I would understand that a clean room versus a cleaning room are 2 totally different things. Clean rooms are controlled environments. Cleaning is where our parts would get cleaned using ultrasonic cleaners. Accounting and finance, same thing. Whatever your industry is in, you will have stories to tell. I have one of my former students is working in a sports betting place. And so again, whole new domain. He's not a sports person. So he has to have those conversations of what is it like? What do I need? What do I need to account for? Things like that. All right, one more example, and then we'll go straight to the tools. I want to talk about a library example, because library books, I have a problem. I like books, especially working here. We read a lot of books and stay ahead of the curve and try to challenge each other. It's a good deal. So I think of, well, as a library patron, I want to search my library's website. I want to check out something. In this case, I want to look for music album. So let's say that I'm looking for a music album on the library's website, and then, aha, I find it. Okay, cool. I want to check it out. I want to listen to it on my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it to download. But it's like, hey, wait, are you legit? Yeah, here's my library card. And then it lets me go ahead and download the MP3 file with DRM. This is another example of domain storytelling, walking through that process. Now you're probably looking at this going, well, at least, Sarah, your lines are linear across. Yeah, but if you're not paying attention, you could probably look at it and go, what is going on here? Include numbers if you can, because then it's clear as to what order those steps are taken. This particular domain storytelling was captured in PowerPoint with the animations and with the numbers. No freehand drawings here either. All right, questions so far before we get into the demo? I'm going to check in chat as well. All right, well, let's go into the demo. So we're going to take a look at egon.io. And I am going to switch over to egon.io. Okay. Do you all see my browser with egon.io? Yeah? Awesome. Thanks, guys. All right. So we're going to take a look at egon.io. It's the website that they call it the domain story modeler. Again, beta v2 online. I think they're moving to Angular and TypeScript, if I remember correctly. V1 is what I'm going to show because this is the one I've had the best of luck with so far. All right, so this is the domain modeler. This is the open area. I don't think it's going to let me zoom it, unfortunately. But you can see on the left-hand side that there's a domain. We have our person, our people, and then our system. So these are our actors. I'm just clicking on them and then placing them. I can also just highlight them and delete them. So these are the default icons. I can give it a name. I can say what domain I'm in. These things in the bottom right corner, they talk about the technologies used to help build the tool, as well as who maintains the tool. But what I want to show you, I already have a file. So I'm going to import it. And I am going to import. Grab the file for domain storytelling. So in my domain storytelling, now in V1, this is the file. It's a DST file. And it's going to ask, do I want to reload the site? I'm going to say yes. So you can see what happens, that we could save our work. And when I tell it to load, it loads just fine. So I could go ahead and I can tell it then to play. What's nice is I can then replay my steps. So this is, you saw the animated version of the other story that I tell. But in this case, you can see that when I press play, it shows here's step 1. And then I can use the arrows at the top to navigate and walk through. One of the things I usually do is I use something like Snagit or some kind of screen recorder, and I'll put the recording video right where this is. If you want to do something like that, I'm going to say go all the way to your end so you understand how wide the area is that you need to capture for your recording. So anytime you see me doing videos where I have domain storytelling and then it's animated, this is the tool that I tend to use. And the animation itself is usually me doing some kind of screen recording and capturing it that way. I can go backwards as well. The step that I'm currently on is bolded, and the color on the number's different. I could say stop. I'm done. Here's the whole entire story. So this is what the story looks like as a whole. Now I want to go back to egon.io from the beginning and show you what this is like from scratch so that we can see how do we get there. So whenever you're doing domain storytelling, you want to come up with the name of your domain. So I could come in here and I could say this is the restaurant story. The description is, it isn't simply scribbling on a piece of paper. When I save that, that has both my title and my description. Now, in my final drawing, you notice that I had different objects and I had different actors. So let's take a look at how do I bring that in. So I'm going to go into settings. So the gear. Again, this is V1. They have a lot of icons that come stock. So I could say that I want like a bike as a work object, and you'll notice it adds it automatically to the objects. I could say I don't want bike there at all, so go to unassigned. I could do things to toggle as actor, work object, and unassigned. Now, the ones that are already loaded in here is because I had loaded my story earlier. But I could say I want to upload a custom icon. And then I could say I want to upload, let's see, like the magnifying glass, for example. And I scroll down to the bottom. Whenever you upload custom icons, they appear at the bottom. Now this one, you can tell some of them I haven't renamed. The ones I haven't renamed when they say noun dash. So these I get from a website called the Noun Project. The Noun Project, I pay a yearly fee, but it gets me access to all the icons at royalty-free pricing, which is what I need. So I could go ahead and add that in. Notice when I add it, it appears in my work objects here. If I wanted to add more people or more actors, I could, but this is what I'm going to use. And then I can change my domain name, so I could say that this is a restaurant and save it. And of course, it's going to be like, do you want to reload? Yes, reload, because it's a web app. This is how this particular app works. Okay, so then I want to tell the story. So first thing to keep in mind when telling these stories is you tell it in the story from the point of an actor. So we have to tell the story from, is it going to be my story as the person who's doing the paying, or is it going to be the waitstaff's perspective? This particular story has multiple actors, but you find whoever your main actor is. So I'm going to create a person. And I'm just going to type me. You can type whatever you want in there. Now I am going to draw an arrow by doing connect with activity, and notice there are no activities. So first, before I can do that, I need to set the activity out there. Well, I need the wait person to actually bring me the bill. That's step one. So I'm going to bring my wait staff. I have a wait staff icon. And so with this wait staff icon, I will label them as wait staff. And they are going to bring me the bill. And so I am going to grab one of these. There's the bill. And I'm going to target the bill. Okay, so now the wait staff is going to bring me the bill. So I come to the wait staff and I can say connect with activity. And notice as I hover over things, we have lines, so we have things we can connect to. Notice I cannot connect my actor to another actor. That no is right there. So I cannot perform an activity on another actor. I can only perform activities on work objects. It automatically knows what step number I'm on, so it's going to add the step number. I'm going to go ahead and say double click on that. Number one is fine. I'm going to use the word just brings for the activity, tell it save. Now I'm also going to connect the bill, actually connect me to the bill. Oh, connecting me to the bill, I'm going to say review the bill. But I don't have in here, so I'm going to move this a minute. Notice as I move it, it'll draw lines for me. So I don't have to have the perfect diagonal line or arrows. I can always click on the line and drag it. But I do want to say I want to go from bill to me because of step one. Now, because I'm going from work object to actor, there's no number on there. So I just need to add a description. If I'm going work object to actor, there's just some kind of describing word for the relationship. So this goes back to step one. The waitstaff brings the bill to me, and then I review the bill. And then I can continue to tell the story by continuing to drag icons out. So I can say, then after I review the bill, then I need to, not that way. Well, let's go that way just so you can see what happens. So I want to go that way. And I'm like, my arrows are pointing the wrong way. First, I want to drag this out so it looks better. But then my arrow's pointed the wrong way. Thankfully, they have a button here for change direction. That'll change it for me. So I don't have to redraw the arrow yet again. But then I can double click on here. Notice when I redraw the arrow and go from actor to work item, the number changes. So it added a number and it changed it. And I can say places. And this here is credit card. And then, and so on and so forth. So here would be my folio. And then they would take that and do the payment processing and so on. So this is how you use egon.io. Is there's a lot of dragging icons. Now you're probably wondering, how did I know which icons I needed? Remember at the very beginning of this presentation, how I drew out the story of the restaurant? So sometimes going into a story situation, you may want to just take notes and draw it out in a notebook, draw it out on a piece of paper. For me, I use my remarkable tablet and just draw it out. But then when you want to tell people the story afterwards, come into something like egon.io or draw.io or something that allows you to use icons, draw arrows, draw circles, and label those arrows. Something like this, I'm more likely to hand off to my client and say, this is the process. My hand drawings, not so much. Those are for my notes, but you can take that approach as well. Now, once I have everything in a spot where I like it, then I can come up here I can export my story as a DST file and I can save this. So this is restaurant 2. Okay, so we got restaurant 2. So that's what happens there. And then I could always load it again. As you saw, I started by loading the story. Now, the other options that I would want to show is you can export your stories. You can export them and add the title as a SVG, HTML. There's a PNG option as well, but I've had issues with PNG not always working. Whereas SVG, I can say restaurant and save it. And then I can tell it to open it. And so this is what the SVG looks like. So it captures the whole image. So you don't have to necessarily get the snipping tool. You can just tell it to save the SVG. The HTML will do something similar. So HTML and save. And then if I go ahead to open the HTML, notice there's my title, there's my description, and it's going to go through each of the steps. So saving the HTML is nice because it allows you to tell your story because it breaks those steps out step by step. So you can see there's keyboard shortcuts. I'm not showing the keyboard shortcuts today, mostly because I just wanted to show how to navigate with the mouse. But if you do a lot of keyboard shortcut stuff, it goes a lot quicker. There's an option here for editing a dictionary. So there's quite a bit you can do. V2, they're experimenting with things a lot more. But this is the modeler that I use when I'm working with the icons. The questions about egon.io. All right. Let's go ahead and go back to our presentation. All right. Do you see my slide for demo egon.io? Awesome. All right. So we're going to skip a lot of the slides here. And that's just because we already walked through egon.io and it cooperated. All right. So now we're going to go look at some frequently asked questions about domain storytelling. So one of the questions I usually hear, how deep do we need to go in our stories? And I'm going to use my favorite answer with every question. It depends. Honestly, it depends. What are you trying to get from this domain storytelling session is what it comes down to. Are you trying to understand a process in depth? Are you trying to understand a process high level? Are you trying to understand something in the domain at a deeper level or a higher level? Whatever your goal is, that's where you're going to want to draw out that story. When I did the restaurant story, I didn't get into the steps of payment processing because we didn't need those details. It wasn't important. Now, if I were working on an online version of that, where you go to the restaurant's website and you want to pay online, now I care about payment processing because I need to write the code to make that happen. I need to know who's the payment processor, what kind of information should I be collecting, how should I be collecting that? So there are certain questions that will come, and then that story fleshes out more. Now I know the steps for payment processing. But I didn't capture that in the initial story because that wasn't part of what we wanted to know. We just want to know what is the process for paying a bill. It's not scribbling on just a piece of paper. So yeah, how deep do you go in your story? Go as deep as you need or as shallow as you need. Who needs to be involved? Get the people who know the processes. Get the people who know the domain. Get the people who have the terminology or the taxonomy that they use already to learn those words. And if you're not sure about using the words correctly, ask the question of, okay, I think you said that the person who's visiting your website is called a library patron and not a client. Is that correct? Confirm that the words that you understand, confirm that understanding. Make sure you're using the right words. But get the people involved, get the people who use the words, get the people who use the words all the time and who that's their expertise. Now, do they need to be exhaustive? The answer to that's no. You do not need to do domain storytelling as one huge system in one huge session. I would say, honestly, deal with it in small chunks. Unless you have one of those domain experts who is a pain to get a hold of because they are so busy on everything else, in which case then you might have to do an exhaustive session just because that's what you could get on their calendar. But if you could do it in smaller chunks, smaller digestible chunks that you can just plan for, that's a lot better to deal with. Shorter sessions on smaller features tend to go a lot easier and tend to be more valuable. Another question I've gotten is, are these stories official documentation? So it depends on where you're at and what they see as documentation, but I would say no. Don't use these as official documentation per se. Use them to help build official documentation. But see these domain stories as visual aids to conversations to understand your domain better. So see them, like I said, as visual aids to help reaffirm that everybody's on the same page. Now, this process leads to more conversations, which will hopefully flesh out more requirements and make it a little bit easier for you to solve whatever problems that they're putting at you. Now, if you're technical, this helps you to understand the non-technical. And if you're non-technical, you can make your technical folks tell the stories and force them to use the words just to ensure that that ubiquitous language is there and that shared understanding is there. It's a good thing to do. Now, you saw the restaurant story, the domain storytelling story for how to sign up for the webinar. The book talks about a movie theater and creating a website for a movie theater and the process is for that. But there are all sorts of stories that you could tell. With those stories, you may want to freehand some drawings. That's fine, go for it. If you want to find other icons out there, you might be like, well, how do I find it? Or I work in a domain that is so obscure that I don't know that I could necessarily find icons. I think I got you covered. I've worked in some pretty obscure environments. For additional resources, so we have the domain storytelling book. They've published it in English and German editions. There's digital versions and physical. I have a physical copy. I recommend the digital copy just because you don't have the page bleeding and the noise of a page on the other side of a physical piece of paper. Egon.io is what I showed today for animating the stories and creating those domain stories. The Noun project is what I use for icons. I've been doing web development most of my career, so over 20 years. And the Noun project's icons have been super helpful for iconography on a website, or in this case, iconography for telling stories. And then Flat Icon's another one of those websites, plenty of icons available. They do have some free plans as well. So that's domain storytelling. If you have any questions about it along the way, feel free to reach out to me. At the end of this webinar, once the recording is done, I will send an email thanking you for your interest in this webinar. And it'll also include these links, plus any other links that appeared throughout the session. And it'll also include the recording link plus the recording password. So rest assured that you don't have to worry about not having these links. They'll be in the thank you email. And if you're watching this afterwards, you get this as part of the recording email. We do have other webinars coming. All of our webinars that we're doing here are free, so feel free to sign up and tell a friend. So we've got Event Storming is coming at the end of September. Then I'm going to do SpecFlow in October, so talking about gathering requirements and using .NET and doing automated acceptance testing and what does that look like. End of November, hoping to do some end-to-end testing with Cypress versus Playwright. Then December, I chose to go a little bit on the lighter side and going with UX because at the end of the year, I know that we're all tired from working on projects all year round, and then we have the holiday crunch time on there. So I didn't want to get too in the weeds and too overwhelming. So that's why we're tackling UX in December. For Nimble Pros and the Nimble Pros training team. So hold on a minute. We got a question in chat. We'll come back to Steve and his stuff. So we have a question in chat from Tim, a question about egon.io. Does the tool support versioning? So you could go back to a previous version of a diagram story if you need to. I have not seen it do versioning. So if you want versioning, I would say save your file in Git. That would probably be the best way to do it and save along the way. So your manual versioning would be the way to do it. Good question. Okay. So Steve and I are the ones who do most of the training for Nimble Pros. So Steve, also known as Ardalis, he's going to be presenting at Techorama in the Netherlands in October. And then he'll also be at Dev Intersection in Orlando in December. So if you want to catch any of us in person, this is the best way to find Steve. He's doing his clean architecture workshop, his solid principles, and his design pattern mastery stuff, as well as microservices. And then he's doing some clean architecture, both in .NET 7 in October and then .NET 8 in December. So you can see those. Clean architecture is .NET 8 in December because it comes out in November. So just be aware that that's finally coming out. You can find me in person. I will be at Momentum DevCon in October and then Tech Bash in November. I'll be speaking on going from monolith to microservices using event storming. So our topic for our webinar in September, I'm going to go a little bit further talking about it. Spoiler alert, I am not going to settle on just microservices. I'm going to fall in the middle into what we call the modular monolith or the modulith. So that's going to be in October at Cincinnati, Ohio for Momentum DevCon, and then Tech Bash, which is the Poconos in Pennsylvania in November. And then, of course, doing the free webinars here online. I do have some of the webinars that I've done in the past year. They are recorded. We have them on our Nimble Pro site. So clean architecture with .NET 7, DDD with C#, real world CI/CD tips and tricks. Today's webinar, they'll all be available on there. So if you're just like, I'd like to learn more about this, it's going to be the same process. You go to the website, put in your email, sign up, and then you'll get an email back with the link to the recording plus the supporting links for that webinar. So the thank you emails that you get for attending these are the ones that we do for the webinars on demand. And if you're interested in getting any help from us, we're good, whether it's implementing DDD in your environment, implementing CI/CD. If you need to upgrade to .NET or soon to .NET 8, we can help with that. If you have to go from something like web forms to Blazor, feel free to reach out to us on things like that. Training-wise, clean architecture, DDD, any of the software architecture topics out there, we're here to help. We want to help you have better developers. And so the best way we can do that is through training as well. If you have any other questions, feel free to either post in chat, come off mute. Otherwise, thank you all for coming today. And feel free to hit me up with questions. You have my email address. Those MailChimp automations that you see, those are coming from me. This is the human on the other side, I promise you. We have a question from Charles in the chat. So any suggestions for doing domain modeling with less than the optimal number of people? Once you have one or two people, actually you can't do it with one. You can if you're doing self-discovery, I suppose. But two people, that's still enough to work with. You might not have all your domain experts there, but you might have that user who's gone through the process, or you might have that person who's gone through at least a little glimmer of the process. Yeah, super small development teams, it can be tricky to get a process like this with number of people to fill the roles. It could be hard to get onto people's calendars. Have the conversations. Get the people you can, and when you know what they understand, ask those. So instead of having multiple people to tell the complete story, you might have to get parts of the story. So you might know the person who does steps 1, 2, and 3, but somebody else is the expert for the service that you gotta call at step 4, and they're only available at a certain period of time. Have the meeting with person who could talk about 1, 2, and 3, and then have a separate one for 4. While it's helpful to have multiple people in there to build that ubiquitous language and get everybody on the same page, I also know that it's harder to do with smaller teams. So try to have those conversations. And then once you have those stories, if you're that person who has to have the conversation with multiple domain experts, share your collection of stories with everybody. By sharing those stories, now you're getting the ability for other people to have that same shared understanding and help them to understand the ubiquitous language that wants to be there across all teams. So sometimes we have to be the bridge. Does that help? Sure. You're welcome. Anybody else? Thank you for coming, Steve. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Visio you could do, but sometimes it's a lot of overhead. Check out Egon, and if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Thank you, Marcelo. And Spitali, I see you here too. Thank you for coming.